Hello, hello. It's Eileen here, and I've got a quick update that I wanted to be sure to share with you before we dive into today's episode. The Resilience Room membership community is going to open its doors for new members Monday, July 28th through Friday, August 1st. If you've been thinking of joining us and want to be sure to be notified when we open, I want to encourage you to join the waitlist. You can do that at go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. That's go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. We only open our doors for new members a few times per year, so if you've been thinking about joining, this is a great time for you to do that. We would love nothing more than to welcome you into our amazing community. So again, you can find all the details and join the waitlist at go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. Okay, on to the episode. So she's telling me about how this new friend was over at their house and she could hear her son getting really rigid in terms of how they played the certain video game that they were playing together. She could hear her son getting argumentative. He was refusing to take turns or compromise. He had to have things go exactly his way. And she could hear her son's friend, his one and only friend, saying, "I want to go home. Like, this isn't fun." Hi there, and welcome to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Devine, and I am a therapist, parent coach, and educator who supports parents that are raising children, teens, and young adults with brain-based differences and challenging behavioral symptoms. If you are a parent or caregiver of a child who has intense, confusing, relentless, or sometimes even scary behaviors, you are in the right place, and I am so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hey there, I want to welcome you back to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Devine, and the topic I have for you today is one that I hear about in one form or another from literally, I think, every parent I've ever worked with. So I'm really confident that it will apply to you and your child or your teen in one way or another. And, based on my experience, it's also very likely a big source of stress and frustration, maybe even heartbreak for you as a parent. And that just makes it, in my opinion, even more essential that we cover this topic today and we dive right in. So today's episode is all about your child's ability or maybe inability to make and keep friends. This came up recently in a conversation I was having with a parent that I work with who is the parent of a middle schooler. Her son lives with a brain-based difference and at times challenging behavioral symptoms. And she was telling me about how her son is super social and he wants to be in the middle of every social situation. He wants to be a part of the action at every opportunity. But he really fails to do this in a way that goes over well with his peer group. Her son is seen as immature by his friends. He's been labeled by them on more than one occasion as being annoying. He often plays too rough, and he just has this tendency to take things too far. So they're messing around or they're joking, whatever it might be. He takes it too far, and he just doesn't seem to know when enough is enough. So this mom goes on to describe to me these challenges he's having with his peer group and how he tends to dominate conversations. He doesn't have any self-awareness about that, and he can pretty easily alienate himself by doing things like talking too loudly or too frequently. There's many more examples, but hopefully that gives you a sense of this mom's struggle and her son's struggles. He struggles. He really struggles in peer relationships, in making and keeping friends. But here, in my opinion, is the really heartbreaking piece that I'm guessing many of you can relate to. And this is why this parent brought it up in a conversation with me when we were meeting. So her son finally has that one friend, right? That one friend who seemed to share similar interests, that one friend who actually invited him over to spend time at his house. And he was, of course, really happy. And his mom, my client, was just as thrilled because she has seen so many friendships go so poorly for him so many times in the past. So she's telling me about how this new friend was over at their house and she could hear her son getting really rigid in terms of how they played the certain video game that they were playing together. She could hear her son getting argumentative. He was refusing to take turns or compromise. He had to have things go exactly his way. And she could hear her son's friend, his one and only friend, saying, I want to go home. Like, this isn't fun. You're not being fair. You're being mean, right? The heartbreak and the grief just washed over her in that moment. She was like, you've got to be kidding me. He finally has one friend and he's ruining it. Like, why is he doing this? And she said to me, I'm so worried that he will never have any friendships that are deep or long in duration. My heart goes out to you if you've ever found yourself in a similar situation with your own child or your own teen. I know I certainly have in my own parenting, and it's heartbreaking as a parent to see our kids in these types of moments, knowing that there will be an impact from their actions and that these actions will affect a friendship that they so deeply crave and that it's completely lost on them. It's unbelievably sad. And I just want to acknowledge that because it's not something parents of typical, neurotypical kids experience, at least not with the same intensity or the same frequency. What we typically don't hear discussed is how a child or a teen who lives with a brain that does not have the opportunity to develop typically or has had some type of impact to it, it works differently in some way, that these kids and teens who live with this brain-based difference struggle just as significantly with relationships and social interactions as they do with various other cognitive skills like, for example, learning and memory or executive functioning. The inability to make and keep friends is absolutely a brain thing. So once we move from, my child is just trying to self-sabotage every relationship they've ever had a chance at, or they're just selfish, or the belief that this has to do with some sort of negative character trait that they possess, when we can shift from that perspective to a brain-first lens that recognizes they really struggle with some essential cognitive skills that are critical to making and keeping friends, it helps us do two things. When we can make that shift, it first helps us to understand what is getting in their way. Why is this consistently a struggle? Why is this rarely working out in their favor? And when we understand that, we can focus on building those skills that are getting in their way, that are lagging behind, that are not where we expect them to be at their chronological age. We do that versus trying to shame them, punish them, or reason with them to just do better. So let's take a moment to take a step back from the behavior and talk about what common lagging skills typically present these types of challenges, the challenges that you see your child or teen have in peer relationships. The first one, and probably the most essential piece to understand, is dysmaturity. Dysmaturity is when there is a gap that exists between the developmental age and the chronological age of an individual. So there's a difference between where society expects them to be at a certain chronological age and where they are. They're on their own trajectory, where they are socially, emotionally, and in relationship to other cognitive skills. Dysmaturity is foundational to our understanding of kids with brain-based differences. It can be an instant reframe. What age does this remind me of? How would I support a child of that age in this situation? Now that I'm thinking about this age, does this now make more sense? No wonder they're struggling in this situation, right? I've never worked with a parent whose child did not experience dysmaturity to some degree. With some kids, it can be quite profound. So maybe half their chronological age. For example, my almost 16-year-old, in many ways, she navigates the world and experiences the world as what I call a mature 8-year-old. It's uneven. It's not 8 across the board. But in general, that's what her age often reminds me of. For some kids, it's not going to be that significant, but it still matters. For example, if you have a 15-year-old and say they remind you of a 12-year-old, that's just a few years, but developmentally, that's a really big gap. When it is a 12-year-old trying to navigate friendships with 15 and 16-year-olds, no wonder they're struggling. No wonder it's not a good fit. So dysmaturity is foundational to understanding why they may be struggling in their peer relationships. Poor impulse control is another biggie. I want this, so I grab it. I want this, so I steal it. That's mine, so I take it without asking. He's in my way, so I push him to get out of the way, right? Acting on impulses, not being able to stop and think before acting. Struggling to put themselves in someone else's shoes, to really, truly understand and appreciate someone else's feelings or perspective. That is a brain thing, a really common lagging cognitive skill. Or the inability to see consequences of actions, to be able to forward think and predict outcomes. So this A plus B equals this really terrible C, like my friend getting upset with me and not wanting to be my friend. If they can't do the A plus B equals C equation, then they can't think ahead. They can't inhibit that impulse to think before they act. It may be emotional regulation skills, like being able to manage their emotional response when they become frustrated with their peer group or their friend, or disappointed, for example, losing in a game that they're playing with their friend. It's not that they always have to have things their way because they're selfish. It's that they have this small window of tolerance where small frustrations cause big responses. It's a lagging emotional regulation skill, not their character. Maybe it's cognitive flexibility that gets in their way. These skills are difficult for many kids. We talked about this in episode 3. Things like being unable to shift away from an original plan or idea, or being able to let go in an argument. Those are just a few examples. I know, even with that small list, it can feel like a really long and overwhelming and maybe insurmountable list of cognitive skills that might be getting in your child or your teen's way when it comes to having successful relationships. I understand that intimately, but I also want to suggest to you an alternative perspective, that there is hopefulness in all of this. And that's because this is about skills, and skills can grow and be supported and be taught. It is not this permanent, unaltering character flaw that your child has, or some other kind of deficit. Now, when it comes to skill building, the reality is that it takes time and it takes frequent reteaching. That this skill building happens in bits and pieces through moments of connection over time. It is truly a marathon, right? It is not a sprint. When it comes to kids and teens with brain-based differences, there is a maturation process. They do mature and they grow, but it is ever so slow. And sometimes it moves so glacially slow that we don't even believe it's happening. And then you have this moment where you see the shift, you see the growth with them in a way that shows real progress. And you get that glimpse of your child's ability to think of a friend before themselves, or your teen comes to you when they're upset by a friend's comment instead of reacting impulsively towards that friend in a way that ruins that friendship and that they regret later. The last piece of this tricky, challenging aspect of parenting is how this is for us as parents. When we see our kids fail in their attempts to have these deep, long-lasting relationships, as a parent who I know desperately wants your child or your teen to have meaningful relationships, it can be so easy to let your fear for their future take over. It's what I refer to as future tripping. When our fear takes over, we find ourselves lecturing more. We have this belief or this hope, this determination that if we lecture them more, that we will convince them finally to behave differently. You maybe have found yourself pleading with them or trying to bribe them into being a good friend, maybe even punishing them or, in our worst moments, shaming them when these peer conflicts come up. While I truly understand this reaction, there's no shame and blame. I want you to give yourself lots of self-compassion. What you're doing is hard, and that's a completely understandable response. That response to our fear and our worry and our sadness, those attempts to change their behavior through power and control, it's not a good use of your time or your energy because they don't address the root cause of the failed relationship, all those lagging skills that we talked about earlier. And that is why we come back to the lagging skills that are the root cause of this area of struggle for your child or your teen. And once we get clear on that, then we can spend our time and our energy focusing on supporting them in those specific lagging skills so that they can learn and they can grow over time. It's us looking for the opportunity to circle back with them and leading with empathy, letting them know that you know they would be doing better with their friends if they could. And using that circling back conversation to help them connect the dots, help them put themselves in someone else's shoes, help them understand how to repair the relationship, what that looks like, and why it's important. That's where the growth happens because we are focused on the skills that they do not have yet. And instead of punishing them, we are focused on connecting with them, relationship, and building those skills. That is a very different approach and path than a behavioral lens, and ultimately one that leads to a different, more rewarding outcome. Before we say goodbye, I want to be sure that you are aware of all the free resources I've created with you and parents like you in mind. You can access them all in one place at go.eileendivine.com/free resources.